You know, even though you're talking about forests, I've worked out at the Ordway-Swisher since, I'll be honest, since the 1980s.
Uh-huh.
And we did a bunch of work in the 80s on acid rain in Lake Barco, and that's what's behind me here in my virtual thing. But that's
right.
that's a NEON, that's a National Ecological Observatory Network buoy that's out there on Lake Barco. So it's really cool.
Nice. Yeah, no, there are so many opportunities out there. It's such a great place.
Yep.
So many different habitats and
I had several students do projects out there. My first PhD student was a guy named Ryan Jensen, who did a leaf area index estimation from satellite remote sensing work back then. And he had an interesting story because his committee wanted to do something more than just the technical part. So he calculated the leaf area index of several places, including Ordway as a whole. But he also looked at Gainesville versus Ocala. And it turns out that Gainesville has a pretty strong tree ordinance and Ocala doesn't.
Yeah.
And it turns out that people in Ocala pay about $130 more a year during the air conditioning season to cool their houses. And we found this out in a really slow news summer that was really hot, and people heard about it. Our university put it out far and wide in the PR system. And people were calling us from Seattle and from Miami, and just to get interviews about this business ordinance.
That's really interesting. I mean,
yeah,
it is a huge difference.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Glad that put it on people's radars. We can use more trees out there.
Oh yeah. Cool. Well, what's going to happen right at 3 o'clock? I'll welcome everybody. I'll introduce you and just let you take it away.
That sounds great. I think I can handle that. Do I have the ability to share my screen? Yes, I think I do.
You should.
It says, I just tried it. It says host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay.
So I don't know if I need to be made a co-host or.
Well, maybe I am. Let me see if I can do something here.
I just made you a co-host. You should be able to now.
Yeah,
Great.
I just did. Now try it again.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, yeah, now I'm getting the prompt that, do I want to stop your screen sharing? So I won't do that. I won't preempt you, but it looks like I'm good to go now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth of our colloquium series for the fall semester. In keeping with the multiple themes that I've tried to achieve with this, of having graduate students talk, having a series on inclusivity, but also hearing the perspectives of biologists doing things that could be construed as geography, and geographers doing things that could be construed of as biology, and people from off campus and people from on campus, we'd like to welcome Dan Johnson. Dr. Johnson is from the School of Forest Resources and Conservation. Excuse me. He's a forester, professor of silviculture. He has his academic background was in Indiana. His Bachelor of Science in Forestry was from Purdue, and both Master of Science and PhD from IU, from Indiana University, in Environmental Science and Biology, respectively. So we have two other Indiana alumna in our department. Dr. Southworth, Master's and PhD were at IU, and my PhD was at IU. So we welcome another Hoosier to come. Dan will talk about ForestGEO. There's that geo prefix, a bottom-up global forest research network. So Dan, why don't you just take it away?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to get to speak to you all. I wish it were in person because I would love to, sorry. Are you all seeing my screen? Can I get some thumbs up? Or yes, thank you. Okay, good. So it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you, and I would love to come over and hang out in geography once we're all able to meet in person again. But I'm going to be talking to you today about one of my favorite topics that's, well, beyond forests, but this network in particular, the ForestGEO network. And so it's a bottom-up network of 171 sites from 27 countries. We've counted over 6 million trees, over 12,000 species of woody plants. On every continent except Antarctica, which makes sense, and Australia, which doesn't. And I know that it's in the works to expand to Australia. So it's been around for quite a while. And if you made ForestGEO a single scientist, which I know is a ridiculous idea, it would have over 65,000 citations. The H index went up since I gave Mike the information. It's now at 260. But it really has been a massively productive network that has grown over the years and is almost exponentially. And has had some really high profile papers and really high profile ideas and inspired some serious debates within the literature as well of, and I think you'll see why once we start looking at what it is. So what it is a network, but who it is really the people. It is not just one scientist. It's probably thousands of people have touched ForestGEO data along the way. This is just one picture of an analytical workshop. So we have analytical workshops every year, except this year, for about the last decade, where we get together folks from all over the world, from all of those plots, and come together and work and talk for 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes about analyzing forest data and pushing those ideas further. So it's oversaw by the Smithsonian Institution, and the director here is Stuart Davies. And then we have lots of staff scientists with the Smithsonian that lead different protocols, but it's really driven by the PIs. So the PIs on these plots buy into a methodology, and that's what really unites these plots, is that it's a methodology where we take a large area from 2 to up to 120 hectares of forest. We measure all woody stems that are freestanding up that are 1 centimeter in diameter and larger, and that's about the size of a pencil. All the stems have their diameters measured. The stems are mapped on the ground along with the topography, and then we repeat that every 5 years. So we have a repeated census of a large area of forest that we can utilize every 5 years. And so where did this idea come from? It started at Barrow, Colorado Island, which is an island in the Panama Canal, and that was created by the Panama Canal. It used to be a hilltop. But now it's a site of ecological research, and it has been for quite a while. And a couple of scientists, Robin Foster and Stephen Hubble, put in this first plot back in starting in 1990, and it took them almost 3 years to get the thing finally installed because they had really ambitious plans. They took 50 hectares, so 500 meters by 1,000 meters. They mapped and measured every single stem in a tropical rainforest. And they've done that since the early 80s. And so this is an animation of every single stem through 8 censuses, color-coded by family. You can see things like streams pop out where there aren't trees growing. There's some trails that run through the plot. But this is an enormous amount of individuals. This is about 300,000 individuals through time. And we've been able to track those through time and look at the vast diversity. And that was the early intention, was to get a large enough sample size to document changes in demography through time in these tropical species.
Now I'm at the Smithsonian Institute, Pepper.
Okay, and they've documented these changes through time and been able to test theories about equilibrium and non-equilibrium states of forests and the dynamics, as well as provide a detailed map of these trees and of an area for other research to investigate a wide range of aspects about tropical forest diversity. And that's really what it started out as a program in the tropics to understand the biodiversity and biogeography of tropical rainforests, and then inspired Stephen Hubble to publish this unified neutral theory of biodiversity and biogeography, which he suggested that tropical rainforest populations could really be described through just basic demographic processes of birth, death, immigration, and then species evolution, speciation. And that would just repeat until it hit equilibrium. This is a pretty controversial theory, but without these big plots to provide information, he wouldn't have been able to come up with this idea. Well, this inspired a lot of people. So starting in the early 80s, we had plots starting to get established in the tropics up through the 90s. And you can see mostly in the tropical forests, but in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, they started to expand in the temperate zone and became what it is now as ForestGEO, as a global network of research plots. And we even have plots up in the boreal zones of forest now. And it's not stopping. Every year we're adding more plots around the world. It has steadily grown since the early 80s. This kind of is another illustration of that. You can see that we've grown in the number of trees. We started adding temperate plots, and it got up to, I know it says 17,500. This is the total number of tree species of all plots. The 12,000 number would be the unique species. So we have the tree species that cross over plots, which is a really interesting aspect, to be able to look at demographics of tree species in different locations around the world. The overarching goal really is to understand biodiversity. What are the mechanisms that control biodiversity? Why isn't there one tree species that just takes over and rules the whole world? What is it that allows there to be thousands of species in just a hectare or a few hectares of tropical rainforest? And what limits temperate forests from having hundreds, if not thousands, of species? We also have a large focus on biomass and carbon. Obviously, in these times, that wasn't the original impetus, but it's a very obvious thing when we can start to look at large areas of forest and what's the variation in biomass across the landscape. One of the interesting papers I got to be involved with was doing just this, looking at the variation in biomass estimates by area sample. So what's your grain size and how good are you at estimating biomass? What we found was that taking elevational range into account is really important when you're estimating carbon on the landscape scale. So remote sensing that's calibrated by small footprint forest plots includes a lot of error that is driven for the most part by elevational gradients. So we needed large area plots to capture that variation. Another recent work that I was part of was looking at biomass across the world and these different plots. And where is the biomass in the forest? Obviously, it's probably in the big trees. We can see that there's latitudinal gradients in the density of stems that we get in a forest plot. The temperate zone is actually pretty clustered down here, but in tropical and subtropical ranges, we get quite a variation in the number of stems, but also in the amount of biomass that's contained in the largest 1% of trees on the plot. So if we just take all the trees and rank order them and look at just the top 1% of the individuals, they make up on average about 50% of the biomass at a forest, but that varies by latitude. So these sorts of revelations are really key to having these large area plots. It allows us to look at these things across global scales. Not only do these plots allow us to look at tree influences, but also biodiversity in general. I think of these as an infrastructure to layer on all sorts of extra questions. So people look at things like insects and vertebrates and other plant species, and a whole host of other things we probably haven't even thought of. We also look at more of the abiotic factors. So most of the sites have their soils well quantified across the whole plot. We span a large range of climatic gradients. Our mean annual temperature ranges from -4 degrees Celsius to 28 degrees Celsius, and that's the mean. Mean annual precipitation ranges from 370 millimeters to over 5,000 millimeters on these plots. So we really span a wide climatic gradient, and we can look at how forests behave differently across those gradients. Things like biogeochemistry become important. Folks are looking at genetics across these plots and relatedness amongst individuals as well as between populations. The biochemistry has been a big one recently, looking at defensive compounds and the spatial relationship of individuals and their biochemistry. And then, of course, as I kind of hinted at, that remote sensing has become a common integrated part of these plots. I'll go on to more about that in a second. So all told, this is a huge network with lots of different aspects and an amazing group of people to work with. And it's been such a pleasure to work with it. And this is how I got into it. So I did my PhD at Indiana University, where we had this old growth oak hickory forest that's at the edge of the glaciation. So southern Indiana is unglaciated or lightly glaciated in certain areas. And it has some really nice old oak hickory forest in this one particular patch. And we installed during my PhD work, I had questions about biodiversity and maintenance of diversity on the landscape. And so we installed one of these large 25 hectare plots during my PhD. And you can see now I can color code by genus. There's not quite as many as BCI's 200 plus genera. We only had, I forget how many, it was about 20 different genera, 35 species in this old oak hickory forest. So in this case, the oaks are in this orange color, and most of the blue you see is sugar maple. So I was able to put this in and use it in my dissertation, as well as doing cross-site analyses at other ForestGEO plots installed in the temperate forest. And it's led to lots of other work that's come out of it. And one of the interesting ones that was inspired by some of the work that Rich Phillips did is we looked at mycorrhizal associations. So somewhere around 90% of all land plants associate with fungi. These mycorrhizae come in kind of two major flavors. So there's ectomycorrhizal fungi, which form a sheath around the root, and they encapsulate the root tip and then send out hyphae. And these mycorrhizae exchange nutrients for sugar. So plants are good at making sugar, and mycorrhizae are good at mining the soil for nutrients. And then there's another flavor, another major flavor, arbuscular mycorrhizae. And so rather than forming a sheath around the root, they actually penetrate the root and set up shop inside, and they create these things called arbuscules, which is basically their shop. And they set up a little trade stand inside there and say, I've got nitrogen or phosphorus in exchange for sugar. And they have this symbiotic relationship. Well, Rich Phillips had this nutrient network idea. So he had this mycorrhizal acquisition nutrient economy that those two different types of fungi actually process the soil and then decompose nutrients in a different way. And so AM dominated plots are kind of a fast turnover system and much more of an inorganic nutrient economy versus ectomycorrhizal dominated plots have this organic nutrient economy, and it's a little slower pace. And so those two different nutrient economies have distinct outcomes on the biogeochemical cycling and carbon turnover in the soil. So we wanted to look at, well, how does that vary across the landscape? And you can see, and this is the Lilly-Dickey plot, just color-coded by dominance using Thiessen polygons. We can see that some areas are a mix, some areas are dominated all by arbuscular and some are by ectos. We took that idea and applied the main hypothesis and said, can we detect this remotely? We know these plots are huge and they contain a lot of pixels. So this is Landsat imagery that we use to use scenes to predict the dominance of either arbuscular mycorrhizal associated trees or ectomycorrhizal associated trees across 4 temperate plots in North America. What we found is we could, using the phenology of these trees and their associations that are known from the literature, we could predict just from spectral reflectance characteristics at the, I believe at the 60-meter scale, what the dominant ectomycorrhizal type was. We were able to take that and scale it up to the landscape and think about how biogeochemical cycling might be different across the landscape using these different, using just this ectomycorrhizal definition between tree species. So these large scale plots, this is only really achievable using these kind of large area plots. So they have I think they have a really amazing power to say some things that are fairly novel. So I went on for my PhD. I did 3 postdocs, and that was mostly dealing with ForestGEO data. I did some stuff on seedling survival, and I did some stuff on tropical seeds, tree survival, which I'm not going to talk about today. But then the whole time I'm thinking about North American plots. So if you look at North America and where the ForestGEO plots are, there's a distinct line here that kind of runs across the center of the country. It's got a belt line, and there's nothing further south than this line. And the forests of the Southeast, if you know about species richness of woody plants in North America, the epicenter of forest diversity is in the Southeast here. And it was really a shame that we didn't have anything. So I was pretty keen on filling in that gap. And I was lucky enough to land this gig at University of Florida, which I'm super grateful to be here, and I'm loving it. But when I got here, one of the first things I did was look for where can I put in a plot. And it just so happens that east of Gainesville, near Melrose, Florida, which is right about there, and it popped up, there's Ordway-Swisher Biological Station, which is about 10,000 acres of natural area, both forest and lakes. And if you look behind Mike Binford, there's one of the lakes right behind him. And we identified with the land manager there a section of the forest that we could use to install a research plot. So this is one of the first things I did when I got here. And folks were like, well, why forest in Florida? And it turns out that forests in Florida are pretty interesting. They're really diverse, but we have this really cool species and ecosystem, this longleaf pine that used to once dominate much of the Southeast. It's thought, and there's some debate about that, exactly how much, but its range at least covered about 36 million hectares, and it probably varied quite a bit in its abundance across that. This has been reduced to about 3% of that original range, or maybe 10%, depending on your estimate, but it's significantly reduced in the amount of land area that's covered by longleaf. So this made it an interesting conservation angle to look at. How are these forests behaving and their dynamics, as well as there's a lot of effort going in to restore them. One of the really cool things about this forest type is it's got this charismatic species. Longleaf pine has a really strange biology. So it lives as this grass stage for a number of years, somewhere between 2 and 10 years, it will live as a grass. So these little things that look like grass are actually pine trees. Some of this other stuff is grass, but they'll live as these pine trees for at this grass stage for 2 to 10 years, like I said. And then all of a sudden, after some cue, they bolt and they shoot up like a rocket, and they call it the rocket stage because it is very much just a single stem going way up with these giant 18-inch needles hanging off of it. And then eventually they form these large canopy dominant tree species. So it has this interesting biology. So that was one thing that was attractive to me. They form these kind of open savanna-like forests, so it's pretty easy to work in. So that's pretty attractive as a forester, rather than working in the saw palmetto and fighting your way through briars and stuff. That's pretty nice. It has another dominant species, so it's pretty low diversity. So there's turkey oak. This is the turkey oak leaf. It's a Crocus laevis. These are actually turkey eggs. This is from the plot. We scared off a mother hen while we're out there doing our mapping and measuring. And these oak areas form kind of a scrubby habitat, and then they get mixed in with the pines. And so that was kind of interesting. We have 2 dominant species at this site. But then the understory of this forest ecosystem and these xeric sites is dominated by a wiregrass species, but also has a vast amount of diversity in the herbaceous species. So hundreds of species have been documented, maybe thousands of understory species have been found in longleaf pine forests. So that's, it's a really interesting situation where most of the diversity is actually in the understory and not in the tree canopy itself. Then it has charismatic fauna as well. So gopher tortoises inhabit these longleaf pine forests, and this is a baby one there with pencil for scale, and they get rather large, and they have this interesting behavior where they burrow. So they're burrowing tortoises, and they dig these large burrows that go down somewhere around 6 or 7 meters in some cases, maybe more, down below the soil. They can have multiple entrances and exits, and they seem to not mind having company because there have been documented hundreds of species living inside of these gopher tortoise burrows. I can understand why they dug these burrows. So out there collecting data, I wanted to bury myself underground occasionally too. But one of the amazing things, one of the key reasons why they are successful at burrowing is because they can get away from fire, and they provide a habitat for a lot of species to escape from fires. And fire is a dominant disturbance on this forest type, and it maintains the dominance of longleaf pine. Without fire, these areas get taken over by other oak species and more mesic tending species. Fire traditionally was because of storms. Most of you probably know Florida has some of the highest incidences of lightning strikes in anywhere in continental US. So the Southeast was a fire-prone system to begin with and had lots of input of ignitions, but also through human land use and native indigenous uses, fire was used as well to maintain the landscape. So all these plethora of things made this system really interesting to me to investigate and put in a long-term forest dynamics plot and put in a ForestGEO plot. So one of the questions I get asked a lot when I start to explain these plots is, how do you go about mapping tens of thousands of individual trees across the landscape? We started with a grid, and that's the way everybody starts with, is we survey in a grid. And so this is our team of geomatics students setting up an RTK station and installing these grid points. We used a real-time kinematic survey system with a couple base stations set up, and we could go along with this rover and put in each of these survey caps. So there's a couple feet of rebar with a cap on top. We installed 313 grid points across 480 by 480 meters. And when we take these grid points and we connect the dots, we get a 40 meter by 40 meter quadrat that with a georeferenced point at the center. That's when I bring in my mapping crew. So we then brought in a group of forestry students, and we use a basic technology, a tape measure and a compass, and we map and measure every tree back to that central reference point on that georeference location at the center of each quadrat. We repeat that 144 times, and we map the entire Ordway-Swisher forest dynamics plot. So we got 11 species and 6 genera. We had 6 families and almost 11,000 stems on the plot. So we did this over 2019 and a little bit into 2020. But something funny happened along the way in mapping and measuring this plot. It was time for a prescribed burn. So this area was slated to burn every 3 to 4 years by the land manager at Ordway-Swisher. And so we got 3/4 of the way through the plot being mapped and measured, and it was time for the prescribed fire. So like any good scientist, we collected data. So we arrayed a series of temperature sensors across the plot. And this is an animation of the fire actually moving through the plot during that burn that was on June 24th of 2019. So this lights up as the fire got hotter, and you can see it kind of stayed hot up here. This was actually a treetop that was burning for a long time. So that was, I'm excited to get into that data once we get there. So one of the interesting things about this system is that fire is expected and the recovery is really quick. So this picture at the top was taken about a month before the fire, and this picture at the bottom was a month after the fire. And while it looks a little browner at the top, that's mostly pine needles and debris that's been burned off here in the bottom. You can see a little more bare ground, but the oaks were completely burnt. All these little poofs of green are turkey oak sprouts, and those just sprout right back. And this system is really resilient to fire. But we didn't stop there. We, of course, put a UAV in the air, and we used Eben Broadbent's Gator Eye system, and we flew it before and after the fire. And he collects both LiDAR and color and hyperspectral imagery. And at pretty low and slow flights, we can get some really detailed imagery of the crowns. And so this is LiDAR that was put together by his postdoc, Gabrielle. We can really make out a lot of detail on these crowns. And Gabrielle's right now looking at change detection between pre and post fire and what effect the fire had on crown dimensions in the plot. We could also take that LiDAR and of course do transects, virtual transects through the forest and look at canopy height and derive models of both the digital surface models and canopy height models. We can also look at individual tree crowns. And so this is just an image of 140 by 40 meter quadrat area. And because we've mapped and measured all the tree stems to georeference points, we can actually determine which crown is associated with which tree. And we know its height from the LiDAR, and we know its diameter from our field crew. And we're going to be able to say some really interesting things about crown dimensions, relations to diameter and height allometric scaling. Of course, I couldn't have done all this by myself. I have to acknowledge my survey crew from the geomatics department and collaborators Stephanie Bullman and Ben Wilkinson and Eben Broadbent and Angelica Almeida Zubrano. And then this is my tree crew, Joey, Jackie, Reagan, Courtney, and Alan, and then a bunch of other people that I didn't have pictures of contributed to this. So why would we go through all this trouble? What are we trying to do? And it's really about the basic core ForestGEO questions, is trying to understand forest dynamics and species coexistence. Currently, we're looking at the abundance of saplings of 2 of the dominant species at the forest dynamics plot and the relationship to canopy openness and canopy identity. So using the Gator Eye imagery from the LiDAR, we can get a canopy height model and then run it through some software to produce gap fraction. So we can look at canopy openness and what that means for the regeneration layer. We also have the map stems. So we can look at basal area, which is the cross-sectional area of a tree, and add up all the cross-sectional areas of each tree. And this is at the 10-meter scale. We can look at, so this map is for Pepo, which is Pinus palustris. So this is longleaf pine, and this is turkey oak here. And look at how it varies in dominance on the landscape and what influence that has on the regeneration layer. So we can look at both gap fraction and where pine saplings and oak saplings are occurring in relationship to the gap fraction. What we're finding is the saplings of longleaf tended to colonize the gaps, and turkey oak was not as strongly attracted to the gap areas. We can also look at the basal area dominance. So in areas that are dominated by longleaf pine, we find that neither turkey oak nor pine saplings themselves, the same species, longleaf pine saplings, occur in those areas where there's pine dominance. If we look at the areas that are dominated by turkey oak, we actually find that both pine saplings and oak saplings benefit from the presence of turkey oak. We looked at it this way in kind of a spatial way with a mixed effects logistic regression model. We also looked at it in a point pattern analysis. So that one of the things that having a stem map allows you to do is to do point pattern analyses. So this is using the pair correlation function, which is a relative to the Ripley-Case function. And we were able to look at pine tree to pine saplings. So this is a bivariate look at the pair correlation function. We see that when it's down below this gray zone, which is our 95% confidence envelope, they're less dense than would be expected by our null model. So we're finding fewer and fewer pine saplings up to about 12 meters away from adult or large pine trees. So we're finding this buffering where pine saplings just aren't co-occurring with the pine trees. The oak saplings are right in the line of that 95% confidence interval or envelope. But they obviously are not occurring at any great abundance near pine trees. But then if we flip it and we look at the relationship from turkey oak trees to longleaf saplings, we find this strong, so when we're above this confidence envelope, this is an attraction. This is greater than expected by our null model. We're finding out to about 5 meters that we are finding a lot of pine saplings occurring underneath oak trees. And this was an observation our field crew had out there, so much so they would call them Quercus pinus. They would be co-occurring right next to each other. So that's a kind of interesting phenomenon. And then we see with the oak saplings that they're also attracted to the oak trees, or occur there more than expected by our null model. There's probably a lot of mechanisms going on here, but chiefly it's the differences in fire behavior. And that's one of the things we're looking towards, utilizing the fire data and some mortality surveys on the plot to dig deeper into the mechanisms driving this attraction. But the litter of pine and the litter of oak carry fire differently and burn at different temperatures. So we're thinking that's probably one of the major drivers for this difference in regeneration layers. So the next sort of for future projections or directions for this project is looking at deeper investigations of this pine oak interaction. They've got about 90% of the individuals on the plot, so they're very much dominating the plot. I've got an undergrad student that's going to be mapping all the gopher tortoise locations across the plot, which should be interesting, and we can look at relationships of gopher tortoises with both canopy structure and dominance by different species and topographic relief. And then as I said, we're looking at fire response and annual mortality surveys and what that looks like across the landscape. We also have a series of areas where we mapped every single longleaf down to the grass stage, and both pre and post fire. And then we just finished collecting the data for 1 year post fire to look at the under 1 centimeter class of longleaf and how the fire affects them. stepping more broadly back, the ForestGEO network in general has some future directions that it's going. So it tends to, we're intending to connect networks. So in the tropics and the temperate zone, there are lots of these networks of research plots, maybe not following the exact methodology, but building those bridges between networks. So I didn't mention this, but the Ordway-Swisher plot overlies several of the NEON plots. So that's the National Ecological Observatory Network, which Ordway-Swisher is one of the key domain sites in this region. And the plot sits partially in the Flux Tower airshed, as well as it contains several vegetation plots that they install and monitor and have been monitoring for several years through the NEON program. So connecting those sorts of networks, there are actually 5 ForestGEO plots that are co-located with NEON sites. So that, and then throughout the tropics, there are thousands and thousands of research plots across the tropics that we're trying to connect with and be able to say something more definitive at a global scale. Cross-site and cross-network analyses are key in answering these large questions that we have at the global scale that need answering. And then expanding interdisciplinary collaborations. So all those things I mentioned, biogeochemistry, remote sensing, most of us that put these plots in don't have those skills. And we build these research plots, which take a lot of effort and a lot of resources to continue and maintain, but they create these really amazing infrastructures to ask all sorts of questions. So that's where I see that going. And with that, that concludes my talk. So I'm happy to answer questions and talk further if anybody's got them.
Yeah, we have plenty of time for questions. So anybody who has any kinds of questions, interesting. But maybe I'll start out while people are thinking, Dan. The people at the Smithsonian have been interested in getting collaboration with NEON for a long time. And you mentioned NEON there at the end. And I just looked up the sites. It's Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, Harvard Forest, Ordway-Swisher, and Wind River, which is out in Washington State. And you just gave me the inside thinking about how exactly those two entities can collaborate with each other. You know, I didn't get a chance to talk about NEON much last week and ran out of time, but it's a top-down standardized measurement, but it also has an airborne observation platform that comes around every couple of years and takes LiDAR data, hyperspectral data, and RGB camera. Do you think that you could take the fine scale stuff that Eben did for you and extrapolate that using the NEON data to the entire site then? Is there potential there? That's the question I have.
Well, and that's the grant we're writing. Yeah, that's but it's particularly focused on mortality. So the agents of mortality and what can we get from these plots that and integrate it with the very fine scale remote sensing that Eben does to the aerial platform that NEON uses. And he's calibrated his sensors so he's getting the same sorts of information. So there should be a nice scaling between those. And obviously the NEON site encompasses a lot more than just longleaf habitat at this one site. And I assume, well, I know those I haven't been to Harvard Forest, but I know that all 4 of those other sites. And they have lots of habitats that vary that are not exactly what the plot is. For example, Wind River, the plot itself is 500-year-old Doug fir. It's gorgeous and 2 meters in diameter, but the whole site is an experimental forest that has a wide range of forest types and management styles. And so it will be interesting to see what we can do and how much we can really build out from that. But I think some of the things focusing on a mechanism or detecting tree mortality or stress beforehand, before tree death, is one of the things we could do, is utilize these plots and do annual mortality surveys is what we're planning to track all these trees through time and take more detailed information on what's happening with them, to then translate that to signatures in hyperspectral remote sensing, or changes in light, crown structure. What is our detectability, and then how does that scale to what NEON does and the scale that they're working at? Yeah, no, I think that's a really exciting thing.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Pete, surely you do.
It's not really my area, Mike. Yeah, it's phenomenal. I mean, the amount of work that's gone into this is phenomenal, and a lot of resources goes into it. We tend to sort of, with these days with so much data available, we tend to caution our students about just getting into data and crunching it without much direction. And I don't mean this as an insult, Dan, because I can see where I think I can see where this is going. But right now, you've got a lot of people collecting a lot of data about this part of this forest, basically one time slice, right? And I wonder, you mentioned a couple of hypotheses that might be testable, but I mean, they'd all have to be spatial variability rather than temporal at the moment. And if it's anything like the rest of the network, then if I understand you, we're going to have to wait 20 years before we get a sample size of 5 in terms of time series. So what, just from your perspective, what's the balance? I mean, someone has to go out there and collect the data, I understand, but what's the difference? What's the difference here between what we encourage our students to do, which is to sort of set up a hypothesis, read what people say, and then go out and collect the data, and what stage this is at the moment, where it's like, well, we've collected the data, and I mean, you've got any sort of initial hypotheses that you might be formulating that future students, hundreds of them by the look of it, would be able to work on?
Yeah, so you're right in several parts there. The hypotheses I'm dealing with are about spatial relationships among their adults and regeneration, because I am stuck at this is one time step point, right? It's all spatial at this point. You're exactly right. There's been a big push within the network from several PIs to try to get annual mortality surveys so that we get something on a temporal scale faster than 5 years, especially if you want to start relating things to climate or disease outbreaks, or you can't wait 5 years to come back and try to figure out what killed a tree. It's hard enough when you're there every year. So that is one of the things, and that's the grant proposal I was talking to Mike about, was to go out and do those sorts of annual mortalities on all those sites and really key down to what's killing these trees, to get at those questions about A, what's killing the trees, and then B, can we detect those through the remote sensing we're collecting, and can we scale that to a broader landscape to say something about forest health? So that's where I'm thinking about this in a lot of ways. That's kind of.
It was perhaps an unfair question, but no. It's what you're setting out to do is absolutely phenomenal, and the use of technology. So don't get me wrong, but I'm just sort of thinking, well, we got graduate students here.
Yeah.
This is kind of highly empirical. You're going about it the other way. Instead of saying, I've read this and these are the problems and this is the way I'm going to go solving them, you just said, like we're going to gather all this stuff that we can about and then we're going to see what happens, which is another way. I know. I mean, I just gather all the stuff I can about rainfall and see what happens. So don't get me wrong.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I intentionally didn't get into the weeds with hypotheses on this as more of an introductory talk to about what it is this network does. But certainly a lot of this is driven by hypotheses, and certainly Hubble and Foster were thinking about, what is it what drives biodiversity in these tropical rainforests, And are there non-equilibrium or yeah, or what are the mechanisms driving that? Is it equilibrium or non-equilibrium dynamics?
Okay,
So,
thanks.
yeah,
Hey, Mike.
yeah. No,
Mike, can I ask a question?
I'll say yes.
Okay.
I don't know you,
I
but sure.
don't know that I heard you, but okay. Hey, Dan, thank you
Go
very
on.
much for an interesting talk. You know, to continue with this commentary on the temporal aspect, I'm curious if you're aware of the Rainfor network in the Amazon basin. Yeah, so they have like 107 sites and maybe 3 decades of work, and they've been able to document, well, in this particular instance, a species shift to large statured trees with greater water recycling efficiency. So, I mean, they're able to get a lot with those 3 decades worth of data. And it's certainly attributable to climate change because it correlates well with, they have climate stations as well. But I was just wondering if you could speculate. I'm not an ecologist, so I'm wondering though, what would be the succession stages of the Turkey longleaf forest under climate change? Do you have any sense of what would happen?
Interesting. You know, I don't know, and I'm new enough here that I'm not going to go too far in that direction. I imagine that they are such xeric site specialists that they won't mind too much of what's coming. But I guess it depends on how Florida behaves and what actually happens here. Yeah, I'm not sure. You have any hypotheses?
Oh, no, none whatsoever. Although the entire state might convert to a savanna of some type, perhaps.
Well, then Longleaf's ready. That's what it would like.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Still have plenty of time.
Hello.
Hi.
I did have a question. You discussed a little bit about potential expansions on like collaborations with other researchers. I wondered if you knew much about thoughts with grazing, with herbivory within these plots and the other plots, especially in the eastern U.S. How much consideration, how much incorporation have they into like measuring deer occurrence abundance on the plots? Because that's overpopulation of deer can is correlated with
Yes.
reduced biodiversity. So I just wondered if there's been any discussions on furthering that in these areas.
Yeah, that's a good question. And herbivory is always a major topic amongst all the plots. So it varies on which herbivore you're looking at, but all of us have herbivores and different abundances. In Eastern North America, it is particularly bad with white-tailed deer. And I studied seedling dynamics for my PhD work, and I used 3 Eastern US plots, Indiana, SCBI, which is in Virginia, and then Wabacon, which is up in Wisconsin. And I can tell you that the deer browse was probably the major reason why a seedling didn't make it past a foot tall. And SCBI is actually the PI is a deer researcher, and he's a wildlife biologist. And he has, the plot is actually put around. I don't know if you noticed it when I showed the 4 images of the Landsat images. There was one of them that had grayed out area at the bottom. And that is actually a 4-hectare deer exposure that's 20 years old, that's inside the plot. And I can tell you from personal observation that inside and outside is a different world. 20 years without deer, there are oaks and hickories that are, 6 feet tall and look very healthy and happy. And outside that fence, you don't find anything taller than a foot tall besides spicebush and pawpaw, which make awful chemicals that deer just don't eat. So yes, herbivory is a huge issue on all of these plots, and so folks are thinking about that. And a lot of people have put in deer exposures in satellite areas. We tend not to manipulate anything inside the plot and try to leave those as natural condition as possible. But that's something that I've been talking a lot about, is doing a series of satellite plots around the plot where we can do different manipulations, like deer exposures or altering the fire regime and that sort of thing. So it is definitely something we're thinking about. But these plots are supposed to be observational. We don't tend to do too much manipulation. They just happen to set that one up around a pre-existing deer exposure. But yeah.
There was a researcher, I forget his name, from Penn State, that had done exposure experiments and incorporating both exposure, gap cuttings, prescribed fire, and seeing which was most associated with like a regeneration of the forest. And with fire and without deer exposure, it could impact the biodiversity negatively from the start. So I just want consideration of that within these. You're looking at spatial diversity. I understand observational wise, but just in that, I just wondered, and keeping that in the back of the mind, looking at how this, right now it would reflect other areas in Florida for sure in that way, but just that thought at least. But thank you.
Yeah.
It's 3:50, which means that some people who have 4 o'clock obligations will probably be leaving, but Dan, if you don't mind sticking around a little longer and answering any other questions that might pop up, I'm sure there will be some others.
No, I'm happy to. And one other point on that question was wild boar are actually a big predator for longleaf pine seedlings and saplings. So they're another vertebrate we have to think about at this plot. And they're actually one that affects several plots around the world as well, especially in Southeast Asia. They've had a boom with the palm oil plantations and really do a number on trees.
Do they affect the turkey oaks too? Because boars love acorns.
I imagine they probably do affect, they affect the success of reproduction, sure.
Anybody else? Here's your chance. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for coming and listen to me ramble on about forests.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for being willing to do this for us. As you said early on, we really look forward to being able to get back and talk to each other face to face and things like that. And lots of luck with your grant proposal. Remember, address macrosystems biology questions.
Yes, great. Yes. Hypotheses at
the continental scale.
Yes.
Okay, then if nobody else wants to ask a question, we'll, Mike Simonovich, I guess we can shut down and go on our merry ways, and everybody have a good weekend.
Yeah, go enjoy this beautiful weather. Thank you all.
Amazing. Bye-bye, everybody. All you students, turn in your reports.